Monday, the 7th of July, in Morwell, Victoria, Erin Trudy Patterson, flanked by 2 security guards, waited in the dock for the arrival of Justice Christopher Beale. As the verdicts were read out, Erin Patterson was stoic. She didn't drop her gaze from the jury, and she looked ahead, calmly. She heard the following words. On the attempted murder of Ian Wilkinson, guilty. On the murder of Heather Wilkinson, guilty. On the murder of Gail Patterson, guilty. And on the murder of Donald Patterson, guilty. Erin Patterson has now been ruled by a court of her peers to have intentionally caused the death of her lunch guests in Leongatha in 2023, after feeding them beef Wellingtons laced with death cap mushrooms. Nino, it's a big day. You've been covering this trial pretty much from the start. What did you think the moment you heard the jury was returning with a verdict?
I thought all the people who predicted that the jury were going to think about it over the weekend hard and then come back on Monday were very clever. I also thought that it's incredible there's some finalisation of this case that's really dragged on for far longer than anyone thought it would. The toll that it's taken on people that are involved in that case, but also on the family. The family weren't there today for the verdict, but you know they were there and sat through every of the sort of 40 plus days of evidence from more than 50 witnesses in this case. And as soon as you see that the verdicts come through, that's where your thought goes to. It goes to the family of people who died here, because regardless of whether Erin Patterson was going to be found guilty or not guilty, nothing was going to change the fact of their loss.
I'm sure that point was being held very closely in the minds of the families. We now have a verdict. What was that moment like, and can you explain what we heard in court?
Yeah, so the jury, 4-person, effectively stood up and gave the verdict of guilty for all 4 charges that Erin Patterson was facing. Guilty for murdering Don and Gail Patterson and Heather Wilkinson, and guilty for the attempted murder of Ian Wilkinson. And for trials that sort of last for weeks and weeks and weeks, they can be quite sort of perfunctory, these moments, and the actual hearing itself, when the jury delivers its verdict, can be fairly quick.
What would have been the main points of evidence that the jury would have considered to get to this point? I know the judge gave them very clear directions before they went away to deliberate. So what would have been the main issues they had to grapple with?
Look, I think the point that emerged in the directions from the judge, but also from all the lawyers in the case, the closing address for the defence with the prosecution, was that different jurors could take different parts of this, that it wasn't going to necessarily be, one key piece of evidence or another, that it was a circumstantial case. Erin Patterson's lawyers had argued that, because of that, they had to be very careful with how they use certain pieces of evidence. They couldn't use one over another because they had to consider the thing as a whole. But they also cautioned them against using, thinking of it like a puzzle, that you weren't necessarily going to get pieces and put them in as the prosecution had wanted the jury to do, because to do that would mean you were jamming pieces of puzzle in to fit an image that the prosecution had of the case. But the judge in the case said, look, to the jury, you can treat the evidence in this case like this. You can treat it like a puzzle. You don't have to do it that way, and you have to be careful when you're doing it that way. But despite what Erin Patterson's lawyers are telling you, it is open to you to look at everything that's come out over the past, 11 weeks here, and see what remains at the end of it, and let that guide you when you're considering your verdict. But some of the circumstantial pieces of evidence that were there that the jury were asked to touch on were, things like the phone and tower evidence that suggested Erin Patterson had been in locations where death cap mushrooms were reported, the fact that Erin Patterson deviated so greatly from the recipe she was cooking for this special meal, some of what was deemed post-conduct offending. So Erin Patterson, dumping the dehydrator that she'd used to dry the death cap mushrooms. Erin Patterson lying to police about having never foraged and about never having owned a dehydrator. there was lots of pieces of evidence that the jury was sort of taken to, as you'd expect, on a trial that sort of lasts over 11 weeks. A big part of it was probably Erin Patterson's, medical history. So whether that be the fact that she lied about having cancer to get her guests over to the lunch, or whether that was around whether she was actually sick after the lunch itself, or whether that was a ruse, as the prosecution was sort of alleging it was. They were all things that would have been floating around in the jury's mind, no doubt, when they did reach that verdict today.
And Erin Patterson gave testimony herself. She was the only witness in her own defence. And then she was also cross-examined by prosecution. I mean, how much of that evidence would have played in the jury's mind, do you think?
I think it's important to say that in my reading of the case anyway, I don't think Erin Patterson taking the stand was something that hurt her case. I think if anything, it potentially strengthened it, because, if her whole defence was arguing that this was a tragic accident, you need to sort of hear that from the horse's mouth. And she got on the stand and she did that. I think what, in sort of broader spectrum, what her evidence did was contextualize what the prosecution said the circumstantial evidence was. So, when she came to explaining why, for example, she lied about the dehydrator and lied to health authorities about where she got the mushrooms from and didn't mention foraging to police, she was able to tell the jury her side of that story, which was that she was panicked that her kids were going to get taken away from her. And so that made her do things and act in ways that she wouldn't have otherwise. So I think that's probably the best way to look at it, in that Erin Patterson getting on the stand meant that every piece of evidence that the jury had heard before that, and you got to remember, she was the last witness in this case. She was the last thing that they heard other than the closing arguments of the prosecution, the defense, and the judge. Everything that had came before Erin Patterson then took on a different hue. And what the jury made of that is ultimately up to them. We're never going to know what exactly was the reason for them reaching their verdict, but it's impossible to kind of say that Erin Patterson didn't in some way influence that by getting up on the stand.
As you say, the jury is making independent decisions about everything they've seen and heard. Can we say there was a moment of the most compelling evidence?
I think that's got to be individual to each person, because, I think certainly everything that flowed from Erin Patterson getting up on that stand was the most compelling stuff in the case. I think depending on who was watching it and when, they would find something else compelling about that. Certainly, her story about accidentally preparing those beef Wellingtons and effectively just reaching for a container of mushrooms in her pantry that she said she thought just contained dried mushrooms, but as it turned out contained death caps. That was sort of unfolded in quite a long fashion, but as it kind of gradually unspooled, I found that very compelling. But I believe it was the next day or maybe the day after, she actually told the jury about the fact that she had issues with, overeating and binge eating throughout her life, and that the day of the lunch, after the guests had left, she'd eaten 2/3 of an orange cake that Gail Patterson had brought round, and then she brought it all up. And that was quite a fascinating moment as well, because pretty soon after that, you were able to kind of piece together, even though it wasn't directly before the jury, that this is something the defence are going to use here as a possibility as to why she hasn't got as sick as the other guests. That was something that had been put to them right at the very start of this case in the prosecution opening, that they should be looking at what reason there possibly could be for Erin Patterson not to get fatally unwell like the 4 other people who supposedly ate the same meal as she did.
I think it's very important that we remember that we've had 3 people. 3 people have died, and we've had a person that nearly died and was seriously injured as a result, and that has led to these charges. I ask that we acknowledge those people and not forget them. I ask also that the Patterson family and Wilkinson family have asked for privacy during this time, and I ask that the media please respect that.
Let's turn to what happened after those guilty verdicts. We heard the judge thank the jury for such a commitment. I mean, it was a big commitment for those people.
Yeah, that's right. It's a 5 to 6 week trial that's ballooned out, so it's an enormous commitment. He also, when he was doing his charge to the jury, he said all of them would be given a 15-year dispensation to never serve on a jury again because of the efforts that sort of gone to. There were two main things, I suppose. It was a very long charge, a 365-page directions to the jury, so it was very long. But two of the things I think he emphasised in that it was probably reinforcing today after the verdict were the fact that it had been a trial subject to incredible and unprecedented, was his word, media attention, and the fact that there had been aspects of it that were quite traumatic, with Ian Wilkinson, their only surviving lunch guest, giving evidence, Simon Patterson, whose parents were killed, by Erin Patterson, the jury's found, but, who also died after that lunch. And, Justice Beale made really clear in his charge that he wanted the jury to understand that, appreciate that, but not let either of those two things affect him. But perhaps his comments today were a little nod to that, the fact that these jurors have spent twice as long as they thought they had to spend, considering a case that's been really without precedent in terms of the media attention, but also on a far more human level, something that just is, it can be really difficult hearing people talk about the death of their loved ones or how they only just escaped murder themselves.
What can we say about Erin Patterson's family? Ian Wilkinson, the only surviving lunch guest. Have we heard any reaction from friends and family, and whether Ian himself was in the court for the verdict?
None of the Wilkinson and Patterson families were in court for the verdict. There was a representative of the Patterson family there on their behalf, but none of them came. My understanding is that they'd made that decision basically after the judge's directions, pretty soon after that, and felt as if they'd bared witness up until that point, but they didn't need to be there for the actual verdict today. And no, I haven't seen any other statement on behalf of them so far.
So we now have a guilty verdict for Erin Patterson. What happens to her now?
So Erin Patterson has been on remand throughout this trial. She'll be taken back into custody. She's been spending the nights of the trial in the Morwell Police Station, which is just behind the court, and she'll most likely be transported from there back to Dame Phyllis Frost, which is a prison on the outskirts of Melbourne. She will face a sentencing hearing at a later date. That's basically a court hearing where the prosecution and defence make submissions to the judge about what sort of sentence Erin Patterson could receive. And then, after the judge considers that, he will hand down a sentence. Now, she obviously also has a right to appeal. She has a right to appeal the verdict, quite separately to a right she has to appeal the sentence, which can obviously only happen after she is sentenced. But that's the general sort of steps we'd expect to happen over the next sort of hours and days. You
flagged this earlier, but there has been huge interest in this trial. Members of the public, unrelated to the case, just showing up just to watch it play out. Has it transformed the town of Morwell?
It's a bit hard to tell because I don't spend much time in Morwell if it's not for triple murder trials, but it's certainly something that is inescapable in the town. It's a town of about 15,000 people, but the little section of the town itself where the court is quite small. There's only two kind of cafes near there. One of them I know on the sort of Tuesday after the jury went out to consider the verdict had its highest day of takings ever because there was just such an enormous influx of media there, and it was quite strange. The typical sort of forecourt outside the court building where people would just kind of punch out a last ciggy or whatever before they go in for a hearing. It's just kind of been transformed while the jury's out with all these large shade tents and media pulling gorilla carts along with their camera stands and every big lights, prepared for live crosses and things like that. So it certainly has been something that has, to an extent, taken over that particular part of the town, yeah.
Nino, thank you so much for your coverage on this. You've reported day in, day out during the trial. And I think there's still more to come as we look at the next steps with sentencing. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.